is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The coronavirus pandemic has changed the way we live. We've had to change our habits, lifestyles, and daily routines. There is an eagerness to return to the pre-pandemic days. However, that will be unlikely until a vaccine or treatment becomes widely available. Although the pandemic has not reached its peak in Africa, several countries are easing restrictions. Shops, restaurants, and schools are starting to reopen in many countries around the continent. However, health authorities are concerned that opening up too quickly could trigger a fresh wave of COVID-19 cases. The World Health Organization has also called on countries to be cautious as they ease lockdown measures, saying while Africa has low numbers of reported cases of COVID-19, the continent must still remain vigilant. This week on Talk Africa, we will tackle whether it's too soon for the continent to open up, and we'll see how African countries are adjusting to the new normal. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. So, to contain the spread of COVID-19, we've had to radically change how we do almost everything, how we work, how we socialize, and how to shop, to name just a few. And some of these new measures have propelled the growth and use of digital technologies and online services. New realities presented by the pandemic are pushing the continent towards becoming a robust digital economy. Let's take a look.
Stuck in the house, bored, hungry. For most, the social isolation at the peak of coronavirus lockdown measures forced us to rely on online services for the most basic needs, our food, entertainment, and as a tool for interacting socially or doing business. Well, here in Africa, internet penetration still remains low. But it turns out COVID-19 could be helping to accelerate a change in attitudes towards online services. The debate among stakeholders is whether the sudden need for safety and cleanliness could be a game changer for Africa's e-commerce and fintech platforms. According to players in Africa's e-commerce and fintech space, they are seeing higher levels of consumer adoption. Popular online marketplace Jumia reported that demand for groceries and essentials grew fourfold in the first quarter compared to last year, with customer and seller interest spiking. Tech firm Okra, which is Africa's first API that essentially connects bank accounts to various apps, has now seen a 175% rise in demand since March 2020. As more companies digitize their services due to COVID-19. In May this year, a survey by MasterCard found that 70% of respondents in the Middle East and Africa now say they are using some form of contactless payment and plan to continue to do so post-COVID-19. While Africa's consumers have begun to rely more on digital tools during this pandemic, even after lockdown measures ease, have those services become important enough to engineer a massive shift in social behavior on the continent and revolutionize its e-commerce and fintech space? With physical distancing measures likely to remain in place in different forms, the world has shifted towards a new reality. No one is sure what the future could look like. And that could mean an abundance of post-pandemic opportunities for Africa's digital economy. Uchio Koronkwo, CGTN Africa.
Let's now broaden this discussion a little bit more and introduce our panel of guests. In Johannesburg, South Africa, I'm joined by Professor Patrick Bond. He's a professor at the University of Western Cape School of Government. In Lagos, Nigeria, Edwin Ikuora. He's the Executive Director for Africa One campaign. And joining us via Skype from Nairobi, Kenya is Dr. Kennedy Ondiba Ongaro. He's the Dean of School of Human and Social Sciences at the Daystar University. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you all for joining us on Talk Africa today. I want to get first a brief comment from all of you, because we are seeing many African countries, easing their restriction measures. We are seeing them reopening their economies. And Rwandan President Paul Kagame has said that it might probably take a generation or more for many African countries to recover from the pandemic. Briefly, tell us, in your societies, what is the path looking like to normality? Professor Bond, let's start off with you.
Yes, here in South Africa, it's an amazing debate finally taking off over whether we want a structural change in the economy, one that is no longer based on excessive reliance on world commodity markets, on international finance, foreign direct investment, but one instead that is more self-reliant and localized and could lead to a more balanced industrialization. And that's a very long overdue debate, and it will affect whether the kind of lockdown relaxation occurs in a humane way with sufficient income support to the very large section of the population now unemployed, and starvation on the rise, and also with medical facilities highly segregated according to class, or whether we just go back to business as usual, which is carbon intensive, and we are indeed the most unequal society in the world. And that's the struggle underway here in South Africa.
All right, Edwin Ikuora, your thoughts?
I think that people are just impatient right now. So the opening up of the economy right now is mainly a response to the pressure, not necessarily because the disease is going down or the infections are going down. It is mainly a response to the pressure. And you could see a lot of people, because it's not full opened yet. In fact, the pressure is still very high. And people are going about their business, still wondering why are we still having some partial lockdown in some places? Why are we still having, we cannot have interstate travel within the country, Nigeria. So people are really, really looking forward to a full opening, because the suffering is really great and people are complaining heavily about this. People cannot, again, people cannot have social gatherings, people cannot have parties, no weddings can take place, no funerals can take place. So there is that tension that is still brewing among the people, among the citizens.
Dr. Ongaro, let's get your thoughts on this. What is the path to normality looking like in Kenya?
It is really very disappointing, and you realize that the levels of poverty in this country cannot allow people to keep on holding any longer, because remember, they live a life of hand to mouth, and therefore most of these particular people, even if you see the impact of this COVID-19, it is largely and mostly affecting people who are living in the slum dwelling areas where the sanitary conditions are very deplorable. And therefore, they cannot in any way keep on holding back in their houses, and therefore they have really lost hope, and they have gone to their places of work where they can be able to put food on the table. It is really very, very sad to really see a situation which is not really put under control, because these are the majority who are able to work in different sections of the economy, particularly in the industrial sector, and the more so they can really not in any way keep on listening to the advices given by the government, because if you really look out how they can be able to cope, because if the government was to give them water, if the government was to give them some subsidies so that they can be in a position to say, really, we can keep to the law, but they can no longer keep to the law, because if you look at the issues of prices have not gone down.
Right.
If you talk about hunger, it's the same price. So they cannot in any way hold any longer.
So we're looking at several scenarios here of how the various African countries are gradually reopening up. And I do want to come back to Lagos and look at, to Johannesburg, Professor Bond, and look at the social aspect, because South Africa has had one of the strictest measures of lockdown imposed. How are South Africans, though, adjusting now today to life after the lockdown?
Well, there's enormous tension, especially in the low-income areas, the townships, the shack settlements, as well as rural areas. And those manifest themselves, tensions in protests over food parcels, which were being given out by the ruling party in a manner described as patronage. Also over access to water, since cleaning hands is so important, and yet the taps or the sanitation facilities are not adequate. So there were protests in many areas of the country, especially the Western Cape. And those were quelled by particularly brutal policing and the army. There were about 78,000 army troops deployed, and at least a dozen people were killed by excessive zeal of policing. So we can see already, as I mentioned, the most unequal country in the world becoming more unequal and also more tense with pent-up anger, occasionally opening up in major protests, even here in central Johannesburg a few weeks ago. But those are being, quite seriously repressed. And the last point, the desperation of people for land and for especially well-located housing means there's land invasions, and yet those are also being dispensed with by authorities. And all of this suggests that once, as in the United States and many places where people are doing social distancing in their protests, and once that technique is learned, I think we'll return to the sort of pressure cooker here.
There has clearly been a sort of fight for the scarce resources, and this has been exacerbated by the measures that have been implemented during the lockdown. What's going on, though, at the moment, once the South Africans are back to normality? Is life back to business as usual?
No, I would say that we go now into the worst public health period because of the ability to flatten the curve over the past 2.5 months, to the credit of the public health authorities. But now there's an explosion of cases. So we're at over 1,000 deaths, at 33,000 cases of COVID-19 positive people. And those are the ones we know about. It may be multiply by 4 or so to see the total. And that's going to create, as the children go back to school this week, as more businesses are opening, much more transmission, and therefore the public health facilities will be overwhelmed. And the big struggle is to get the private healthcare, which is about half of the resources, only serving 14% of the people, to get the private healthcare to supply not just beds, as is now arranged, but the full gamut of health services, and also to get our testing results coming in much more rapid. There's about a 7-day delay. These are huge challenges for an apartheid-style health system, where if you're in the right class and race group, you've got decent care, but if you're in the vast majority, you don't. And I think those are the pressures and tensions that this government's going to struggle to hold down.
Right, Edwin, though, a report from the World Health Organization, the Africa CDCs, and other organizations have been suggesting that Africans should first open up vital sectors of their economies only when the data shows that it is safe to do so. From what you're talking about, though, because you're talking about uncertainties still existing in your societies about exactly how the reopening up process is going, is it too soon, though, to reopen business? Is it safe to do so at this point? What do we consider those vital sectors that should be reopened?
Honestly, we don't know if it is too soon, because if the infection rate have not increased so much, the question is, what is the justification for continuous lockdown? That is on one hand. But the other thing is that the opening has also come with guidelines. The guidelines of keeping social distance, the guidelines of always washing your hands, and public places making sure there is soap and water and there is sanitizer. And those kind of guidelines are also still in place. So if we say it is too soon, it is mainly because we think we haven't reached the peak yet. But I think with a large number of testing that is taking place now, we are getting a real sense of what the prevalence is looking like. So I would say it's mixed. It depends on who you ask. There is a graph right now that is circulating in Nigeria where it says in the early parts, corona was very low, but the fear was so high. But right now, I can tell you in Nigeria, the fear of corona has gone really low, and the disease is also increasing. So this is the contradiction that we face in our society. So we really can't tell if it is too soon unless the evidence speaks for itself in the near future.
All right, Edwin Ihuora and Professor Patrick Bond and Dr. Kennedy Ongaro joining us there from Nairobi. Do stay with us. This conversation continues in just a moment. For now, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more on how African countries are adjusting to the new normal. Stay tuned.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue our discussion. Still joining me in Johannesburg, South Africa, Professor Patrick Bond. Also joining me from Lagos, Nigeria, Edwin Ihuora. And here with me in Nairobi, joining us via Skype, Dr. Kennedy Ondimba Ongaro. Thank you for staying with us on the program. Professor Bond, I want to talk a little bit about the economy here and Africa's economies, because South Africa's economy is already expected to contract by about 7% in 2020. What will be the cost and economic impact of the restricted lifestyles and the changing ways of life brought about by COVID-19?
Well, the central question people have been debating here is how do you get an economic revival through fiscal policy and monetary policy, meaning how can the state spend more in a strategic way? And the answer seems to be to boost some of the existing grant systems for elderly and especially for mothers taking care of children. And then there's also an emergency grant. Now, these aren't very big. They're in the equivalent of about $20 a month. So they're not really going to go very far. But the central question for monetary policy is whether our central bank can loosen up, not follow the dictates of the world markets and the credit rating agencies, but engage in, some call it a quantitative easing, which would allow them to fund government spending directly and to expand perhaps even to a basic income grant to support economic consumption at a time when unemployment has gone over 50%. That's a huge debate. And you know, our president here, Cyril Ramaphosa, is also the African Union chairperson this year. And the version of this that we see him transmitting to the continent is the need to cut debt repayments from African countries to the West and also to China. And that begins to become hotly contested because with Donald Trump in power, with other conservative governments in Europe unwilling to engage in substantial debt cancellation, and with the Chinese only doing a debt relief, a postponement of the problem, I suspect that not only South Africa with $185 billion debt, but the rest of the continent with over $600 billion will be unable to pay. And at that point, some kind of debt default mechanism, hopefully one that is unified from Africa's leaders, will be needed. And I think that's within the next months. It's not long before we see even a South Africa unable to pay. And the IMF will come in the next few weeks with about $4 billion loan. Right. But we're talking large amounts now that can't be paid because the commodity prices have crashed so far.
Right. Edwin, as African governments, though, look at tailor-made solutions to facing their challenges, how do we ensure, because Africa had made a lot of progress over the last 10 years, particularly with the SDGs and the MDGs, how do we ensure that the progress that has been made over the last 10 years is not negated as a result of the measures that we will have to undertake post-COVID-19?
Thank you. First of all, I think there are two dimensions. So there is a fiscal dimension in terms of the liquidity, the investments that need to be put into specific sectors. And I think one of the most important things we've seen from this COVID pandemic in all of its ramifications is the fact that people may die of hunger before they die of the disease. And now, with that in mind, any country that is not food secure, that is not able to feed its own population, become much more vulnerable. So we were expecting to see a response that focuses on the food sector, on agriculture. Africa is not only dealing with the COVID pandemic, we're also dealing with locusts in the Eastern African axis and the Horn of Africa, right? So if you do not take specific strategic action on food production, then you become much more vulnerable. Now, having looked at that, in terms of where you put your money, the sectors that you invest on the African continent, the other question you want to ask yourself is, where is the money going to come from? And I think that is what the Prof just talked about in terms of how do we get debt standstill, so that, because again, like you see, sometimes African governments use as much as 50% of their annual revenues, of their resources to service debt. And so that is why calling for a debt standstill, is the quickest way to get the liquidity to be able to make these strategic decisions that we're making at this point in time. But when you look at how the country kicks back into gear or protecting the progress we've made, the first SDG of no hunger, that is the key part. Once people are healthy, then their immune system is boosted, then they can do other things. That is number one. The second part is the social sectors, health and education. If the investments do not go into health to strengthen the infrastructure, the next pandemic will wipe out a generation. And this is something that has to become more strategic, because now we've seen the link between the health sector and the economic sector. So if you don't put the money in the health sector, you are coming to a point where you will lose everything you've made. Then, of course, the education sector. So the social sector and the agricultural sector are two key areas that we should expect investment to protect the progress that we've made in the past few years. Otherwise, we are going back and getting more people into the poverty line or below the poverty line.
Professor Bond, I want to get your thoughts on that creation of balance, and at the same time, reinvigorating the economies, though, to keep jobs and to avoid a total collapse, because tourism, for instance, which is one of the mainstay of African economies, though, the UN projects that up to 2 million jobs might be lost, indirect job losses through tourism alone. So how are we going to how are we going to keep the jobs as well as avoiding a total collapse of these vital sectors of economies?
Well, some may be vital, but some, because COVID-19 will be with us for a very long time and air transport is very limited, we probably have to see them go into mothballing. And that means, I think, a localization, especially of production, where we were importing from especially East Asia, labor-intensive goods. Maybe it's time to restart the factories, especially in a country like South Africa, which lost half of its manufacturing over the past 30 years to trade liberalization. So there is now a localization strategy that the government widely endorses. However, whenever you get a crisis of this sort that amplifies the existing inequalities, the voices of ordinary people are not often heard, and the people who want to go back to work fastest are usually the big companies, and they have a lot of sway in government. So to conclude, I would say that the trade unions are most interesting. They're getting reports from their members on the ground, and to listen to trade unions and to see them trying democratically to come up with exactly that response. How fast do we go back to work? How much protection do we need? And how much can we demand that the payments, especially from government, where there's a big debate over civil service payments, can be retained. And secondly, not just unions, but the others in civil society that are also close to the ground, that work on food sovereignty, that work on gender equity, that work on public health access. These in South Africa have a C19 People's Coalition, and your viewers can easily find that online, C19 People's Coalition. And every couple of days they make reports that say, hey, you're going too fast in this sector. Oh, you've left behind this group. And I think civil society watchdogging now is more vital than ever. As the inequalities in the society get extreme, listening more to the bottom up will be good for all of us.
All right, very interesting insights indeed. But I want to get a final comment from you all, because Africa is slowly emerging from lockdowns, reopening their economies, and generally issuing new measures for what we are going to call the new normal. So, Dr. Ongaro, let me start off with you, though, because as you look ahead in this scenario, what do you see? Very briefly.
I see a very dark future ahead of African countries, Kenya in particular, because of lack of serious regulations coming from the government. They are not there, because we cannot be in a position to really tell our people the seriousness of this particular pandemic. And therefore, I see a situation, a society where we are going to have high levels of unemployment. We are going to have issues of depression. Many families are depressed. We are going to have a lot of issues of family violence. And at the end of it all, we are going to have situations whereby people are going to lose their properties because of high levels of retrenchment. Because remember, many of them, or majority of them working in the urban settlements, they had committed themselves to different types of mortgages, and some of them had invested. But therefore, it requires the efforts of the government to really sit together and find out what they can do with the richest groups. Then the government can be able to ensure that if some people had committed themselves to some different types of mortgages, how best can they even salvage something that can keep them going?
Right.
Because if that is not going to happen, then we are looking forward to have a chaotic, a disorganized society where we are going to have even the issues of urban slum dwellers actually ballooning up.
All right, Edwin Ikworo, I do want to get your thoughts as you look ahead. What do you see?
My final thought is that I think the new normal provides an opportunity for Africa to restart or rethink its production processes, to rethink how it grows its own economy locally. And this is the idea: is how do we think about local production so that we can employ our people and not be cut off because of changes in the global supply chain. So I still see a future where Africa begin to think for itself, produce for itself, eat its own food, and that itself can be a better future for all of us.
Professor Patrick Bond, you have the final word on this. What do you see as we look ahead?
Well, both the pessimism from Nairobi, the potential optimism from Lagos could be, let's say, resolved if we understand this is a struggle over resources. And just what Edwin said, the digital divide in the continent and in a country like this is extreme. And I know as an online teacher how difficult it is for students to get the data on a lifeline basis. So there's demands for rights to information, for free internet. Even one of the leading bankers has endorsed this. So I think this would be, as Edwin says, a potential fourth industrial revolution advance. But typically what that means is that the big tech companies are in control. They do it through surveillance, through the commodification of all of our personal information, through the basic big data commodification process. And I think that's where the states have to listen to the people and say, we need this information as a human right. I'm more optimistic, certainly, because I've seen again and again the 1980s when a democratic wave came through, the mid-2010s when many countries in Africa, after the 2011 North African uprising, threw out bad governments in about 18 countries. And if you see the anti-racism movements in the world, centered now in the United States, come out of nowhere, take the risk of getting out into the streets, trying to social distance and wear masks, but really show the democratic spirit, that's where I feel much more optimistic, because some of the momentum from the last few years of Africans uprising, sometimes against the Africa rising when it was against their interests, still can move forward even under these adverse conditions.
Very diverse but interesting insights indeed on the program today. Thank you all for your contribution. And that's all we have time for this week on the program. A big thank you to our panel of guests. In Johannesburg, Professor Patrick Bond. He's a professor at the University of Western Cape School of Government. In Lagos, Edwin Ikworo, he's the Executive Director for Africa One Campaign. And joining me via Skype from Nairobi is Dr. Kennedy Ondimba Ongaro. He's the Dean, School of Human and Social Sciences at the Daystar University. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback, and do keep the conversation going online through our social media handles on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Until next time, goodbye.